Welcome to Sensing the Signal. I'm Terry Patar from Atreides. We're exploring the overlap between data, technology and intelligence in our increasingly volatile and complex world, what this means for national security, and how deeper insight can help organisations make better decisions. I've spent the past 20 years helping organisations improve their intelligence capabilities. I'm fascinated by how we understand the world around us. Now I get to talk to some of the leading voices who I've learned from myself.
This time, we're joined by Kateryna Bondar, a senior fellow at the Wadwhani AI Center at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Kate, welcome to the podcast. In fact, welcome back. You're a returning guest and it's wonderful to talk to you again.
Hi Terry, this is such a pleasure to be back. Thank you.
Excellent. And also joining me on the podcast again is my colleague Chris Toast. Chris, welcome again.
Yeah, hi Terry and Kate. I'm very excited for this one.
Yeah, me too. Kate, the reason we wanted to get you back on the podcast is you've continued to push out a lot of really important research on what's happening in Ukraine and the war that's going on with Russia, obviously. And this time, we wanted to talk to you about some of your recent research, which takes, I think, a slightly different angle that I'm not sure many other people are really covering, which is also what makes it interesting. And I think, there's a lot of important key points from your research, but I'm just going to mention the sort of key overarching themes so that everybody listening kind of knows what to expect from this conversation. But the main areas you've covered are three areas that are really kind of connected and overlapping. But you've looked in your recent reports that you've published at Russian command and control systems and how they've developed recently and the adaptation that's gone on there. You've also then looked at drones and how uncrewed systems are being advanced and the kind of environment in which they're, I suppose, created, the ecosystem that they've built around that. And then connecting those two areas is the use of AI. And I think within the drone area, it's AI for autonomy. Within command and control, again, it's about speeding, I guess, their decision cycles. So all of that's incredibly fascinating because I don't think anyone else is really shining a lens on exactly how Russian defense technology and capability is developing in that way. So it'd be great to sort of delve into that with you. And have I characterized that in the right ways in terms of those big themes?
Yes, Terry, that's exactly right. And, I decided to look into this war and make an analysis from a little bit different angle and from a different side, because it's great that we're talking about Ukraine and developments of technology and AI and, tactics, doctrine, everything's going on in Ukraine. But I think it's very, very important to understand what's going on the other side, from Russian side, because Russia is very different from Ukraine. We can talk a lot about this, a little bit later. But Russia also sets an example and shares its lessons learned with Iran, for example. China is watching Russia. So it's like, a backbone of a new axis, I would say, in national politics and geopolitics. And I think it's really important to understand what Russia is working on and, the directions it's looking into and how technology develops there. Because Russia is constrained by sanctions, Russia is constrained by access to compute, to new technology, and still they're progressing and advancing pretty fast. So maybe there are lessons that we can also learn from Russia, but it was just, for deeper understanding what's going on in C2 and AI deployment and admin systems for us to think about. So yeah, I'm happy to dig deeper about any aspect of this topic.
One of the things that really struck me in looking at your research and the kind of key points that have come out of it is actually some of the speed of adaptation that we've seen in Russia. Is that something that I know you've been tracking it on an ongoing basis, but has it maybe also taken you a bit by surprise to see how fast they've developed and how they've developed? Because I think maybe you can describe this in terms of how their infrastructure has changed and how some of their doctrine has also changed around how they approach defense technology.
Yeah, sure. So, for Russia, I think the challenge of adaptation and speed of adaptation was much bigger and much more complicated because, first of all, they're bigger military, just, in terms of numbers, in terms of systems, in terms of complexity and geography and everything. Second, Russia hasn't changed that much. I mean, it's still like a Soviet legacy system, heavily centralized, with legacy, nuclear triad and all this kind of stuff. So for Russia, adapting to this new challenge of unmanned warfare, of integration of AI, of speeding up the kill chain, AI-enabled intel analysis was so much more complicated and bigger challenge than for Ukraine, because we have to understand that Ukraine was slowly adapting since 2014 because NATO trained Ukrainian troops. There was some technology transfer. Ukrainians started developing their Delta system, the situational awareness system, in 2016, whereas Russia was relying on its legacy systems and was thinking that just because of its size, number, and overwhelming capabilities, it would take Kiev in 3 days. So when Russia finally realized that they have to adapt and it's not happening in 3 days, this is where, they actually sped up their adaptation so fast that I think that's pretty fascinating. So yeah, they actually made a leap. I'm not saying that Russian military right now is completely new military, modern military. No, they still run in the same issues, like old, Soviet mindset. They have this internal resistance of old system versus new system. They have generals who are visionaries, who want to introduce and implement new technology, and they have old generals who actually resist in this and want to fight as they used to fight. Since Soviet times. So they're running into a lot of issues, but what I'm just trying to say is that we have a stalemate right now on the battlefield, and it says that Russia keeps pace in adapting as well as Ukraine. So, but it's much bigger, it's more complex adaptation, and I think it's worth looking into.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking into what you've written about as well, I think some of the interesting aspects are how, in terms of C2, the focus has been on software and development of software that will, I suppose, enable them to operate in a different way, but also enable them to make use of better and more advanced technology. And I think when you've talked about AI capabilities, for example, being used, can you talk to us a little bit about the sort of differentiation in different types of AI capabilities that they're bringing to bear in this area? Because it's not necessarily sort of even across all areas in the way that they're applying AI capabilities, and I think that would be really key to try and understand.
Yeah, AI capabilities. Let's get to this a little bit later. Let me just start from kind of broader overview of what's going on in C2 and how Russia adapts.
Sure. Yeah.
It's really interesting because Russia is not an exclusion to many militaries who are having this huge, big abstract concept of combined all-domain command and control, when everything's automated, everything's digitalized, everything's secure and works really fast. All systems talks to each other. You can integrate everything with everything. I mean, weapon systems, intel sources, chain of command, and all this kind of stuff. So Russia had the analog of US CJET C2 for like 20 years. It was called automated analysis system. Basically, it's a very complicated term in the Russian. I don't want to translate it, and it doesn't make sense.
Sure.
So, but it's it's a huge concept when all systems are integrated, everything's automated, and everything works perfectly. So they had this concept for almost 20 years, and it hasn't even started, so it hasn't even materialized. So when Russia faced real battlefield problems, 2023, 2020, even 4, they realized that, it's great to have a big dream, But let's be practical. Let's look into problems that we have and let's actually start solving them. So Russians realized that now they use 80% of their strike missions are conducted with unmanned systems. They're like, okay, this is our major weapon system, so how do we make it work? And to make it work, we need software to basically, create drone units, to enable communication of engineers, navigators, professionals working with electronic warfare, drone operators. You need software to make this crew work, and then you need to integrate these crews with fire units and to enable this fast kill chain from detection to strike, basically from reconnaissance to engagement, to enable this work not in hours, but in minutes. So, and here Russians also leverage their civil society, they're civilian engineers, so-called People's VPK, which is translated like People's Military Industrial Base. These are volunteers and civilians helping the army. And these people started to develop software addressing these specific issues on the battlefield, like integrating drones into one common operating picture, integrating these data sources into platform which makes analysis faster and more effective, and actually connects intel and striking capabilities. So they developed, for example, this Glaz Groza system. It's, in translation, it's eye and the lightning. So you can see in real time what's going on, and with lightning speed, you can strike and engage these targets. And this software proved to be effective, and Russians started to scale it really, really fast across the force through formal military education, but it started with private drone schools. So all new operators and specialists who are joining the force and who are becoming basically part of their army, going through this education, going through this training, and when they get to the battlefield, they already know how to use the system, and they cannot actually fight without it. So that's how they addressed an issue of, solving practical problems of the battlefield. When they identify working solution, they manage to scale it really fast. And basically their military leadership says, why would we invest a lot of time and money into development of something similar within the military structures and institutions and everything, where we can leverage commercial technology and civilian creativity to solve the problems that the military has. We just need to find those people, those solutions, and give them access and way to deploy their system. So I think that's pretty fascinating when a military can, reject its own big dream and ambition and build in something like CJAT C2 and just switch to real working solutions, especially coming from civilians and commercial sector. This is something new. This is something unprecedented for Russian military and for big militaries as well, including the US military. There's also a lot of problems working with non-traditional vendors and commercial technology. So that's an interesting case of adaptation and leveraging this capacity to improve military operations on the go, under the fire, basically.
And so thinking about that, and this is also reminding me of our previous conversation from last year, where we again referenced the JAD-C2 system and this concept around creating a capability where everything comes together. And we were talking about how other countries should be looking at what's been developed in different pockets of innovation in Ukraine and trying to learn from that. So I guess the question I've got is, do you think the Russians have almost been better at learning from the way that Ukraine has developed its defense technology than maybe some other countries have?
It's always hard for me to compare Russia and Ukraine, who is better, who is worse, because It's not like it's a dynamic situation. It's not stable. We cannot have, a winner or loser, or to say like who's winning, losing, who's better or worse. It's just, the speed of adaptation. What other militaries should learn from Russia and Ukraine that's exactly what we're talking about. And I don't think that any other military is even close to where Russia and Ukraine are. The reason is obvious. I mean, a real war, existential threat in Ukraine, high political stakes and propaganda in Russia, yes, but no other military, I think, is even close to that pace and to that level of adaptation and cycles of iteration and integration of commercial tech into the military. I'm not sure what the silver bullet solution is for that. I don't want to say that it's the real need in the form of war, but yeah, that's what foreign militaries should analyze in a very detail, and just to understand what's applicable to their systems, to their institutional landscape, to their private sector landscape, where the strengths are, and their current geopolitical situation. And yeah, it's not like copy and paste approach, but this is a learning curve, and we just need to pay more attention to both sides and pick what's applicable to every single country and military.
Yeah, well said. But I think you really phrased it so well when you described how they've given up on their dream and they've pivoted and they've taken a completely different approach because they've learned that they need to adapt and they need to develop and innovate much faster. And so, yeah, that strikes me as something that is, more of a global kind of takeaway for militaries elsewhere that we should be looking at and learning from. So yeah, that's fascinating. I want to bring in Chris at this point, because Chris, I can feel across the ether that you're probably burning to jump in with a question, and so I'd love to open up to you and throw in some questions.
Yeah, thank you. There's so many places I want to start with this, but I think that you mentioned something, Terry, about being adaptable and this adaptation, and you use that in the context of the entire Russian machine. But I wonder if we break that down to the individual platforms. So you mentioned, Kateryna, about the Shahed and the Yelabuga in your report and in other podcasts, etc. And obviously that's the thing that everybody knows about, whether we call it the Garan or the Shahed. Obviously, Yelabuga is an entire ecosystem in its own right. We've got so many different production facilities in one place that allows that thing to be scaled and produced. And I think it's taken a while for the West, we talk about NATO, it's taken a while for NATO to reject the idea of small, exquisite, expensive pieces of kit and move more towards low-cost, scalable bits of kit. But I wonder just how adaptable is it? If we realise that kit isn't working on the battlefield, how quickly and easily can they replace a sensor or change equipment versus they have to do a fundamental redesign? And how much are they either being slowed down or sped up by the fact that they're building a platform that either can or can't be very quickly iterated?
That's a great question, Chris. And when I talk about Russian iteration, I specifically stress this point that Russians are very good at experimentation, and basically, they throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. Sorry for this, metaphor, but that's exactly what happens. And what enables this speed of experimentation and number of experiments that they have is that they don't use this expansive, exquisite systems, and especially when we're talking about unmanned systems and drones. And these are like very simple, almost DIY drones, which you can just assemble from something that's available in every marketplace, or you can just buy in your local store, like ply and wood, for example. And you can experiment with the airframe, you can experiment with payloads and communication systems, etc., etc. So Russia adapted this approach of producing very cheap systems available materials and components, and these are like I've even seen conversations that we need to prioritize commercially available components. So because of sanctions, because of availability, because of Chinese supplies and everything. So like priority for commercially available components, priority for cheap components, priority for fast assemble and speed of changes and experimentations. That's kind of, the menu of things that they have and that they use to iterate this fast. And sometimes, you can see that something is just glued or 3D printed or, attached with a stripe or something like a Ziploc. And basically, it's like almost a kindergarten. We had this lessons in the kindergarten and elementary school when we were encouraged to play with something available, at home and to bring something that we can create, like small little models of, toys, etc. That reminds me of my childhood and this Soviet approach, and probably this is where it comes from. Russians are very good at this, and they don't care how the system looks like. They don't care that, a company need to sell it to the Ministry of Defense, in a higher price or this and that. Yeah. They're bothered with real battlefield results, and that's what drives this innovation.
Well, you mentioned the Ziploc there, and that sounds like a very strong parallel with what the Ukrainians are doing as well, whether it be UAVs, USVs. They realize they need to attach some extra bit of kit onto their platforms, and then, the amount of tape and other bits of ad hoc mechanisms that are being used there. Now, on the one hand, that sounds very scrappy and effective and quick, but on the other hand, it actually sounds quite inefficient. Like, would it be better if the Ukrainians and NATO were thinking ahead about these kind of things and saying, we don't know what sensor we want to attach, but we know we need some kind of standardized attachment platform that allows us to quickly swap things in and out. So could we get to a slightly better stage where we appreciate the need to adapt and iterate, and we build these base platforms, even if they are very rudimentary, we just build some systems into them that allow us to standardize, whether it's attachments, sensors, control platforms, etc.
That would be an ideal scenario, and I think this is where we're heading, and especially Ukrainian military, because in Ukraine there are multiple companies who focus on specific components or on specific parts that they produce, and they're interested in making these parts easily attachable and integratable, if I may say so, with base airframe, for example. There are other companies who focus on producing only basic airframes, and you can attach basically anything. And that's, I think, the best realization in real life of this concept of modularity. Here in the US, everyone's talking about modularity, and everything has to be modular. You have to be able to replace some parts and update some parts and without updating the whole system. But in practice, every single company is trying to produce a final product, and the military doesn't even have the right to repair it. Not even talking about, changing some components on the go in the battlefield. So I think there is a huge gap between understanding the problem, acknowledging the problem, and actual practical implementation of this scenario and idea in practice. So, and I think this demand signal has to come from either NATO structures with their NATO standards or from particular militaries, but it has to be a requirement that systems should be modular, and for components manufacturers that these components has to match different types of platforms. Probably that's the only way to motivate companies to make their things basically more modular. And Ukraine is showing this example, same as Russia, because this innovation goes kind of bottom up. So it proved to be working that, if you can replace a communication system right on the battlefield, your mission might be much more successful rather than you are having only this drone with only this communication system. And if something changes, in electronic warfare landscape, then your system just fails and you cannot accomplish the mission. So it proved that that's the right approach. That's how things should evolve. But let's be honest, it's so hard to rebuild the whole military industrial base, and to make manufacturers switch mode so fast, especially when it brings a lot of money, when you can sell exquisite products. And, if the military wants to change something, instead of ordering one component, they have to buy a whole new system. So it's also, a business part. There is a business component to this problem, I would say.
I think the reason why I'm interested in that is because it seems like quite an easy win for any government to, I think a parallel in a non-military context would be making everybody transition to USB-C, just standardizing that across the industry. Obviously, some people are annoyed by that. But what it does is it just means that there's less waste. It's easier to adapt. I think there's a new ruling coming out in the EU about all mobile phones must have easily replaceable batteries. I think that might come in quite soon. So these things seem to make sense, and it seems to be something that is a relatively small lift for a government to do, that then optimizes what we can get out of the civilian industries. So you can keep all of that innovation and exciting new ideas in the civilian space where it probably belongs, but you can just put some rules around that mean that everything else is more cost effective, more standardized, more easily adaptable and integratable. So it sounds like that could be an option for NATO to sit around a table and say, okay, what have we seen work well in Ukraine? And what rules could we put in place for suppliers to make sure they're not just trying to make loads of profit from us, but they're building these things in a way that all work together more seamlessly.
I do agree that would be the right approach, and that's the right thinking, and I also share this vision. However, in Ukraine, I was working on integration of NATO standards into Ukrainian military, and I saw the practical side of this problem, because yes, you can have a standard, and let's keep in mind that NATO is subnational level, and actually NATO doesn't have any real enforcement mechanism. Like, if they come up with a standard, in practice it's really hard to make governments and their militaries to really make these changes, especially when it comes to adapting and adjusting military industrial base, so it goes even beyond the military itself, but it affects manufacturers. Yes, you can kind of launch this chain of change and events by issuing a standard, which, has been happening for the past, 30, 20 years at least. But in practice, honestly, it's very challenging task to enforce those standards and enforce this change. But I think we don't have choice, because with these systems becoming more cheap, iterable, and we need them in mass and at scale, which is like no economy can sustain these costs. So these systems cannot cost millions and millions of dollars. We will have to adapt. We will have to go cheaper. We will have to go modular, just to reduce the cost of any potential conflict. And I think that would be the main motivation for militaries to actually start changing.
Yeah, and I think there's one thing that I want to talk about, which I think has been maybe slightly overlooked by other people that have shown interest in your work, or maybe I've just not heard it yet. But I wonder if this shift in mindset and manufacturing approach and creativity, both in Ukraine and Russia, I wonder if that has produced new vulnerabilities or new single points of failure that we should be looking for. And I think if I think about an example from a more traditional military context, when you fight, for example, a tank, unless you have the right weapon systems to approach that, it's a very difficult machine to attack for obvious reasons. It's designed that way. It's hardened. It's got good defenses. It's got lots of offensive systems on it. But that tank relies on fuel. And so if you can find the fuel tanker that sat, however many kilometers behind the tanks, and you remove those from the battle space, then all of the tanks run out of fuel within a day and become very vulnerable. And then I wonder about how we can apply that same thought process to the supply chain or the ways that they're being built or the communication systems with this new battlefield technology that we're now faced with. What is the equivalent of an oil tanker on the battlefield when we're talking about drones and the technology that Russia and Ukraine are using?
Well, if only I had an answer of one single, fuel tank, probably Ukraine would have already won this war. That would be amazing. But, these platforms are so diverse and their application is so diverse that it's really hard to find one single solution which could, win in the war drone, let's call it that way. But it has some bottlenecks. I mean, you need to have a lot of drone operators, and these are people who need to have relevant skills, and you need to train them, and you don't become a drone operator just playing a simulator or a video game. So for Ukraine and Russia, it has become common, type of warfare, but other militaries, they just don't have a pool of drone operators able to fly these drones effectively for military operations. So I think the training bottleneck is one piece to that. Of course, communication system, because you can use different platforms, you can use ground systems, aerial drones, sea drones, but they all rely on communication to these drone operators. So that's a big vulnerability, and that's where a lot of innovation happening and race. Basically, I wouldn't call it an innovation race, but adaptation race. I don't know. A manufacturer produces a drone flying at this frequency, then Russians come up with jamming, they jam this particular frequency, then you need to update this communication system, etc., etc. Fiber optic drones is another answer to communication problem. Satellites is another answer to this communication problem. So, and it's all cost effectiveness ratio, because you cannot, satellite communication is one of the most effective. It's really hard to jam, or even impossible to jam, but you cannot put a Starlink terminal, even a mini one, on a small FPV drone which costs $400 and flies only once in its life, right? So there is a game of, what you are trying to achieve, at which price, and what scale do you need. So I think this communication aspect is a real vulnerability, and if you're able to come up with a solution which could interrupt this connection between an operator and a system, that would be something really valuable for winning in this war. One of the ways to solve this problem is software, and here we're getting to the concept of autonomy and AI-enabled autonomy, and we can talk about this deeper, but answering your question, yes, human capital, communication, and probably scale. That's another aspect where I think supply chains and reliance on particular countries, and we know what we're talking about, right? It's China, is a huge fuel tank on this field. Militaries starting from Ukraine and Russia and finishing with the United States, trying to figure it out fast, how to rebuild their supply chain, how to get access to critical minerals, and then build supply chain in their home countries, just to avoid this huge vulnerability and dependence on one country in terms of component supplies. So drone warfare, unmanned systems, that's why I don't like when people call it a revolution or a complete change in the war, because it's not perfect. It's just another, I would say, iteration in military art and weapon systems that are available right now. But they're also not perfect. There are countermeasures that exist. There are vulnerabilities, and there are bottlenecks that we need to overcome and solve. So, yeah.
There's three key points that came out in your response there that is just ringing in my mind. The one is we talked about vulnerabilities already a little bit, And I wonder if we think about predictable patterns, maybe rather than like looking for that, that silver bullet, the equivalent of the oil tanker. But so whether that's the marketplaces, the behavior of the people that are involved in this activity, all the way from the supply chain to the operators, the delivery systems, and maybe even things like property acquisition. So I remember in Ijevsk, in the early phases of setting up a lot of these manufacturing facilities, they would take over a shopping mall. And actually, if you looked into that a little bit, there was usually some kind of fire at the shopping mall. I don't know if that would be some kind of insurance scam or something on the Russian side, but the shopping mall would catch fire. Next thing, it would be repurposed, and it would end up being some kind of drone facility for Zala or something similar. And then you would see complaints from the locals saying, can you stop turning all of our shopping malls and all of our local facilities into just the war machine, please? And so if we knew to look for that in advance, or if there were other examples of that, I think, there are some indicators that Russian's military industries is changing in some way. Is there anything in all of those behaviors that could help us better understand what they are doing now or what they're doing next, or help us identify other vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think we should look into, with Russian military, it's really hard to understand without having access to classified information. But even those statements that their government officials are making, like, for example, the Minister of Defense, can give us some directions, to think about, and then we can cross-check this information and track what's going on, for example, from communications of civilian engineers. So I'll just give you one example. Minister Belousov announced in 2025 or even 2024 that all drone operators need to share, and basically the military wants to build one database of all drone strikes conducted by the military. So they started collecting this data on strikes on all weapon systems that they were striking, including Western weapon systems. And they also wanted to understand how human operators work. So basically not only recording, videos, what you're hitting and what you're engaging, but how you do it. And that gave us a pretty good hint that they're thinking about autonomy, they're thinking about training neural networks to act as humans, because autonomy is hard and you need a huge, and this sits somewhere, at the intersection of robotics and LLMs, but you have a little bit different data set to train robotic systems. So Russians initiated this process quite a while ago, a year or two ago, and just recently we've seen the first unmanned systems being deployed in fully autonomous mode. So it means for example, V2U drone, it didn't have any communication system with the drone operator, and they were sent in swarms, and these swarms were showing some pretty well-coordinated behavior, and they were showing some not very predictable approach to the target, which means probably they could be trained with the help of this data collected from human operators. So I think Russia is approaching the future of its warfare more strategically. By this, I mean that they're building a foundation. So basically, to develop AI systems, you need a lot of data. And they started from this. They didn't start from writing an AI strategy or announcing huge projects or, making a big PR campaign about how cool and AI-enabled we are. But they started from building this foundation. And I think pretty soon we will see some results of this work, because we've already seen the software not managing, it's not the right word, but helping to orchestrate unmanned systems. I'm not sure that there's a lot of AI in there, but I think it's just a matter of time when it will become AI enabled, and AI will help them to make decisions, basically. To edge autonomy, when we see more and more AI-enabled systems. AI performs different functions in this system, same as on the Ukrainian side, but Russians are approaching this strategically. And I think in future we will see more fully autonomous systems. And we should also remember that Russians are not constrained with any ethical concerns, and you, Chris, know about this more than I do probably, as you did this super important work on war crimes, and you know what Russians are capable of. So it doesn't really matter for them if they're gonna, kill some civilians, or a system would make a mistake, or there will be huge collateral damage. They are willing to experiment, and we're coming back to that point about experimentation, that they're willing to try everything, see what works, and if that works, they will scale it, despite any international law, regulations, ethics, morality, or anything like this. So yeah, it's a strategic approach, and we will see its fruits and results, unfortunately, pretty soon.
You mentioned we talk about measure of success for the Russians, and I think it's quite easy to look successful when your approach is so indiscriminate. And I think maybe one defining factor of Russians' military approach, both with manual equipment, whether it just be basic artillery systems through to the more technologically advanced stuff now, is that it all just appears to be very indiscriminate. There's a very, very, very high civilian casualty rate. And so I'm slightly reluctant to look at that as a successful outcome, because there's just, I guess, if your only goal is to create mass destruction, and yes, that will suppress the enemy, but you're doing so at such a high cost. I'm not convinced that means they've got a particularly advanced system. It just means they're willing to deploy that system indiscriminately, which seems to be how they operate at the moment.
Yes, exactly. And for them, it's actually, given their goals in this particular conflict and war, part of their strategy is just killing Ukrainians, right? And we all understand that, Russian leadership just doesn't see Ukraine as a sovereign country and Ukrainians as a nation. So it actually helps them to achieve their goals. And I'm sorry, maybe I'm just too straightforward and not being diplomatic, but we need to acknowledge the real reasons of this war and the real motivation behind it. So, and it also plays a psychological effect, because, when you listen to their military bloggers and all their propaganda actors, you understand that psychological effect and psychological operations is part of their strategy. So civilian casualties and collateral damage probably even helps to achieve their goals, unfortunately. But they're working on making these systems more precise, more accurate, because in the end of the day, you need a perfect weapon rather than just mass destruction. For mass destruction, they still have nukes, and that's a completely different story. With unmanned systems, they are so they're so agile. They're so, you can use them in so many ways. You can complete so many missions with different tasks. It can be, laser focused on one single person, or it can be a swarm of drones destroying everything. So basically, I think Russians are experimenting on all these applications, and it just depends on their military goals where they will put their focus on and where they will iterate more and achieve some meaningful progress.
Yeah, I want to bring you just back to, I mentioned there were 3 points that you reminded me of as you were talking earlier, and the other 2 points were around the supply chain. And you mentioned how Chinese kit seems to be very prevalent in the supply chain, which I don't think is a huge surprise. What was a surprise to me when I looked at the teardown sites, Ukraine has a very good system of finding equipment, pulling it all apart, logging all of the equipment online so that everyone can see. A lot of that equipment still seems to be coming from the West, especially America, a lot of kit from there. And that's that's no criticism of America. I know that they've got sanctions in place, and that a lot of this kit is, potentially making its way into that Russian supply chain, not with any kind of backup at all from America, but nonetheless, it's making its way in. And I think what's most interesting about that is that Russia seems to still rely on it. That Russia still seems to need such a high proportion of equipment that is from areas that will be quite challenging in terms of accessing that equipment.
Yeah, we made an analysis where the AI enabling equipment comes from, and it's mostly hardware, chips, and sensors. And yes, you're absolutely right that more than 50% of these components come from U.S. headquartered companies. I wouldn't say U.S. directly, but U.S. headquartered companies, which means, I don't know, NVIDIA, for example, can have a manufacturing facility somewhere in Taiwan and other countries, and there are ways to smuggle equipment from different parts of the world. So, but it just means that there are countries which are champions in different aspects. Like Chinese, for example, are good not only in cheap components for FPV drones. They're super cool in cameras, and nobody can replace and beat their cameras. And both sides, Ukraine and Russia, are using those cameras and rely heavily on China, because an average camera, like higher quality than is needed for a small little FPV drone, costs like $400 from China, and it has super high quality. The closest equivalent available from any Western country, and not as good as Chinese, costs $1,500. So that's the difference. And same with chips and AI-enabling components. Western countries have mastered this production, this technology. It's hard to beat, TSMC and NVIDIA in quality of chips, and to establish mass production really fast. So yes, we will see reliance on these countries in these different ways and components, and it's really hard to rebuild supply chains fast. So I think we should just prioritize, and we should really analyze where these bottlenecks are and prioritize localization of these components in our home countries, or at least in the West. And that this has to become the first and the biggest priority, because to really cut off smuggling, to prevent smuggling, is hard, and I would say it's almost impossible. So when our adversaries would still have access to this hardware and technology, what can we do? We can just probably accelerate in our own production and develop our own technology. And yeah, that's kind of a new, weapon race, I would say, or production race. But that's the world we're living in. And yeah.
Well, I think that brings me perfectly to my final point before I hand back to Terry, who's probably as much on fire as I was at the beginning of this conversation, to jump back in. But
this has been fascinating. I'm loving listening to you guys talking through this, because
well, I promise I'll be quiet in a second. But you mentioned this new arms race, and I think that definitely is the way that I perceive what's happening at the moment. And we've also talked a little bit about China in that. I think about Shenzhen when, and I'm probably horribly butchering the name of the city, but it's essentially described as the Silicon Valley of hardware, and it's a place where you can design and iterate, prototype microchips, or even more broadly just electronic components very, very quickly. And so you could submit a design on Tuesday, and by Friday the thing's been built for you, because all of the different component manufacturers are all in a very concentrated space. They all work super long hours, and the turnaround rate is incredible. And it seems like the idea of a Shenzhen in Ukraine and in the West would be a really good idea, a place where it's not just building specific drones or different weapons platforms or any kind of technology, but just a space where technology more broadly can iterate very, very quickly, instead of waiting 3 months for your microchip prototype to be actually produced, you'd be literally getting it the same week. And so, does any of that resonate, or would that be a bit too extreme, and we don't really need that level of infrastructure to still get what we need out of advancing our technology in time?
No, Chris, I think it's critical. It's crucial to be competitive, because like I lived in Singapore for 2 years, and I've been to Shenzhen and other Chinese manufacturing clusters pretty much, and seen and saw how this works. So yes, and I do agree that one of the success factors to Chinese manufacturing boom and manufacturing success is this clusterization and geographical proximity. I think here in the West we kind of underestimate this factor, that even geographically, these companies, talent, everything has to be concentrated in one place just to speed up this exchange of ideas, exchange of technology, innovation, again, iteration. And again, it's a huge separate topic. That's another podcast probably, because I was really fascinated with how this works in China. And when I was back to Ukraine, I was like, oh my gosh, let's pick our strongest, capacities and capabilities, where we have talent, where we have some science, scientific potential, etc., and let's build clusters around those strong points where we are like really great. And in Ukraine, we had pretty strong aviation school. For example, the biggest transportation plane, Mriya, was developed in Ukraine, and there was big manufacturer in Antonov in Gostomel, for example. So I was like, let's do that. And unfortunately, in the West, it's kind of underestimated aspect of this geographical localization and clusterization. There is a belief that everything can be transported with great, transportation system, railway, roads, and aviation and everything, but it creates so much additional cost and expenditure and time lag, and no concentration of talent where people can exchange ideas. It's so ridiculous from my standpoint. So I think we should really look deeper into this aspect and really start building clusters, because, again, practice shows it's working. So why wouldn't we replicate something that is working?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, we look at this like it's a problem, but we could also look at it as an opportunity, because nobody seems to be doing it yet in the West. And so the whole of Europe, Ukraine, America, those that do really get their head around clustering. I like the idea of clustering geographically and not just thinking about this as, bringing together skills remotely. So I learned recently that a cargo ship moves at roughly the speed of a bicycle. And when you look at it through that context, and the fact that this bicycle has to travel across oceans, you just realize how much time that adds into any kind of innovation if you're factoring in such a slow process like that. So geographical concentration seems like such an obvious thing to do, and the first country that embraces that and invests in it seems that they would benefit from that significantly.
Yeah, and I was asking myself a question like, what could make this happen? And I ended up, maybe that's not the perfect answer or not the only reason, but I feel there's a huge difference in mindset and mentality and economy between East and West, like broadly, because here in the West, we have a very decentralized system, right? We have free market, we have competition, everyone is building something, on their own, and we're competing with each other, which is great, which is also like a vehicle and an engine of innovation. But in the East, they have this centralized system when the party says, you know what, we need to build, electronic vehicle or electronic autonomous and electric vehicle industry. and they just pick a place and they just provide incentives, maybe government investment, subsidies, like they create all conditions for this industry to be established and thrive. I'm not saying that that's the best approach, but it's like centralized decision, central decision, distributed from top to down, like, hey, we're going to have this cluster established here, and let's build everything here, attract best talent, attract companies, and let's make this happen. I don't have an answer which approach is better or worse, and as I mentioned, it's really hard for me to do these comparisons, but I think this is like a deeper reason why we took such different path in industrial development and economic development. And so probably we should rethink a little bit our approach to industrial development and clusterization. We can call it a clusterization, but maybe this is some sort of central, idea that, hey, let's make this our focus, put all our resources behind it, and let's compete not inside between each other, but with internationally with our adversaries or competitors on international market. So maybe that's also something to think about and to look into.
So Kate, it's been so fascinating hearing about your research into Russian defense technology and the capability and how it's developed. I wanted to just bring it round to one of the points that you've mentioned in your research around the use of AI in particular, but also generally how it's being adopted. I think, when we hear about AI a lot these days in the media, etc., it's often in the context of people losing jobs or worrying about losing their jobs to AI. And one of the things you highlighted was that in designing and building this whole ecosystem in Russia, there's actually a real focus on the sort of talent and growing talent and the range and number of AI specialists that they're going to require by 2030 and the number of UAS specialists they're going to require by 2030. So it seems like actually they've really factored in the whole system of, infrastructure, regulation, the industry, but crucially talent development. And they realize that, if you want to use AI, actually you need to develop the talent. Is that something you think that is, from the research you've done, is that realistic in terms of the targets they've set themselves? Are they likely to be able to build that pool of talent? And I guess this links partly to what Chris was discussing there about clusters and developing clusters. Where does that talent come from, I guess?
Yeah, so talent is something that you cannot buy, right? You need to grow talent, and educating people, training people takes time and takes a lot of effort. So, and again, as I mentioned, Russians have a very structural, fundamental approach to solving problems. And that's why when it comes to talent and they quickly realize that it's a bottleneck, they start from the beginning, from foundation. So beyond, introducing separate specializations in universities, in AI, in robotics, they start from schools. They start from elementary school. So when you go, you start going to school, your first grade, you already have courses in robotics. And probably this is a legacy from those lessons that we had in our school, making different models and toys. They also start doing this, but they're building this talent pipeline basically from early childhood to identify best talent and to prepare it for both unmanned industry, and we're talking about not only military but mostly civilian unmanned industry, and slowly converting it into AI-enabled and autonomous unmanned industry. Because if you look at Russian approach and even their formal official documents, it also goes top down. So on the highest level of presidential decree, the president identifies unmanned systems like civilian drone industry and AI integration as two major priorities for the country for the next decade. And then it, translates into national projects, like national strategies, and goes to federal level. So basically goes to every single land in Russia and goes through educational system, goes through financial system, creating financial incentives, goes through transportation and infrastructure system, creating flying testing ranges for unmanned systems, creating regulation for frequency and air traffic, frequency management and air traffic control. So it's a very, very comprehensive approach. And if we're going back to the talent aspect, Russians see that they will have and they will need 1 million people working in unmanned industry by 2030, which means they need to grow this talent, they need to bring up this talent and prepare for work in the industry. And that's where they're starting from the kindergarten. Of course, there's not enough time to have 1 million people working in unmanned industry by 2030 if you start from the kindergarten, but it just says that they're thinking strategically, they're planning long term, and if everything goes according to their plan or even not perfectly, it just means that pretty soon they will have a huge talent pool prepared to work in drone industry. And in Russia, everything that is civilian automatically translates into what is military. So we will see a reflection of their unmanned industry development in the military domain. So again, it's just, this engineering, comprehensive, end-to-end approach of building the whole ecosystem around their priorities. And this is probably what we should learn about. And that's probably a good manifestation and example of this, what we call clustering and top-down focus and priorities that we've seen in China 30, 40 years ago. Russia is taking not the same approach, not the same route, but it resembles a lot when you focus on something that you think will define your future.
That's fascinating. Thinking about that overall approach and that kind of whole structure that they've got in place and the way that it's so comprehensive. This is obviously, you're very much focused on this in a professional context, but this topic is deeply personal for you. And I just wanted to ask, as you've been going through this and researching particularly Russian capabilities, how worried are you in what you're seeing in terms of the way it's developed and the way that they've managed to advance and adapt and iterate so quickly?
Well, definitely I'm very worried because every morning when I wake up, I check the news because my family is in Ukraine still. And, every morning starts for me with the question, are they fine? Were they bombed and attacked this night or day? And, I hear and I see the progress of Russia in developing not only technology, Shaheds and Gerani and all other drones, but also their evolving tactics and how they deploy these systems, how they use these systems, how they combine them with conventional weapon systems such as ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and all this kind of stuff, how they select targets and what military strategy they have in terms of destroying the country and its infrastructure. So, unfortunately, it's not only my professional, but it's like my personal, I wouldn't say task but it's my internal call to closely monitor and watch what's going on in Ukraine because it touches my family, it touches my friends, and what is more important, their future. Because, when I talk to them, I see that they're very optimistic, they're very strong, and, I respect them for this position a lot. But also I see that people cannot plan their future. People live in a constant situation of uncertainty, and trust me, it creates such a pressure on you. I'm not even talking about, some problems with just usual comfort and basic needs like heat and electricity. And, this winter was really hard. But, this background stress that you constantly have when you think about your future, when you're trying to plan your future, when you're thinking about the future of your kids, when you're thinking, should I have a kid or should I have a second kid? And sometimes the answer is no, just because of this situation. So I would say that it's not only about this war and technology. It breaks people's lives in a way that really hard to measure and really hard to see, in some tangible way. But I see the effect of this war, and it's been for years already. So it compiles, and I see how people change. Although they stay strong, they're ready to fight till the last drop of blood, but just not to live under Russian occupation and under Russians. And even when I talk to my parents, I'm like, well, maybe you should move to Europe or to the United States. I'm happy to help. And they're like, nope, this is our land, this is our home. We're not going to cede even one single centimeter of our land. We're going to fight till the end, but no Russian is going to be here, and we're going to be as strong as we can. But Russia is not going to get anything just like that. So, and that's really fascinating to me. And I don't have an answer what's going to happen or like how the things will evolve, because you see that situation fluctuates. It's Russians who were advancing now, they're kind of stuck, and Ukraine makes some advancements, but in general, I would still call it a stalemate. And I think what might happen, like what the resolution, if I may say so, might be, is probably lies in economic domain. Whose economy will sustain, whose access to technology will be better, who's going to be able to build more resilient supply chains and local infrastructure. That's where the answer is going to be, but not probably on the battlefield itself.
Wow.
That was a long
Thanks
answer.
for sharing that, Kate. No, but it's so important because, I think everyone can kind of read your research and understand the important points you're raising from it, but getting that kind of personal perspective from you on kind of what it means for people in Ukraine in terms of what's happening right now, but also how it ties into some of the things that we've been talking about in, the trajectory. It's not just kind of what's happening now, it's where are we likely to go to, and that's the uncertainty that we all have, but we see the planning and we see the development of this type of technology. And it is ultimately, it's worrying for everyone, but particularly, from your perspective, there's, I can't imagine what it's like for you or your family in Ukraine. And so please, thanks for sharing that. And I just wanted to give Chris an opportunity to maybe come in. And Chris, if there's sort of any kind of last questions we wanted to ask Kate, because I think we've kind of gone through a lot of stuff on this conversation, and I feel like I've got a lot to take away and absorb, even having read Kate your research that you've published. But getting that additional perspective has been amazing. Chris, any other things you wanted to touch on with Kate before we kind of bring this to a close?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just to acknowledge that very personal part of this, I think it's very easy to try and block that and to just see the very scientific or measure this in a very sort of how does this affect the industry? But this is affecting people's lives every day, and you get a glimpse of that when you're there, and it sticks with you, and it's very emotionally. It's very moving even for me, which I don't have anywhere near the same level of connection as you do, Kate. And so just to say I really acknowledge that, and I'm with you and with everybody in Ukraine. And I think it's particularly challenging with the news cycles, which are now a lot more distracted in other parts of the world. And this is still like a raging campaign that's happening, which is probably also like falling off people's awareness a little bit because of the other crazy things happening around the world. So I also appreciate you bringing that, back to our attention. There is one question which is slightly tied to our a previous episode with Mark Mathieson from Purple Sector, and he said in our conversation that you get what you measure, which I thought was a very interesting way of looking at problems. And so my question to you, Kate, is what do you think NATO should be measuring in order to, stand up to this new battlefield technology?
That's a very good question. If we're going back to strictly technical aspects and, unmanned systems is a new type of warfare, I think NATO should be measuring like cost effectiveness ratio, first of all. NATO should be measuring its options in defense, in offense. I mean, for every threat, you should have a countermeasure that is relative to the threat, and probably that brings us back to cost and cost effectiveness ratio. You shouldn't shoot down a $50,000 drone with a $4 million air defense system. That's basically what I mean. Exactly. Also, the ability of the military industrial base to scale production. Because maybe it doesn't make sense to produce, drones in millions right now and stockpile them now. But we need to make sure, and we have to be sure that if we need drones in mass urgently, we're ready to scale production and surge production really quickly and to respond to this incoming threat. Maybe there should be some, stress tests for military industrial base or just industrial base or supply chains or something like this. But ability to scale production fast, this is something that we should measure. And the third aspect, which is critical right now, and especially in unmanned warfare, is direct communication between the end users and manufacturers. Because as we see, it is really easy to iterate with these systems fast, and that's what our adversaries do. So if we don't establish this communication and feedback loops from the military to manufacturers and back, we risk to lag behind in this innovation race and iteration race and adaptation in general. So probably these are three major things I would focus on and start measuring and, introduce some indicators or criteria that we would like to achieve.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for taking the time to rejoin us on an episode of the podcast and talking us through this really important topic. I'm sure that we're going to be coming back to you at some point in the future to talk about the next things that you research and are writing about, because, I know you're focused on these crucial areas that are fascinating for everyone and not necessarily getting a lot of attention as we talked about. But I've learned a huge amount again from talking to you and hearing all about this. And so thanks again for making the time and coming back on. So you're always welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Chris, you and I, we work in the defence tech space, and so, we are often thinking about this from a very technology-oriented standpoint and thinking about the actual development and innovation, etc. But what would you say was perhaps the most important aspect from what Kate described about how Russia's developing its capability that we could take away and think about how it gets applied elsewhere? Because obviously, as she talked about, Ukraine and Russia are sort of leading the way forward in terms of the development of technology, obviously because they are involved in this existential conflict. So, yeah, what was your sort of main kind of takeaway from it?
Yeah, I think it was very powerful how she brought that back to a very human experience, and it is very easy to try and block that out, I think, and just look at the great work she did in her research and the report and get excited about what that could mean for advancing our own technologies, identifying future threats, but ultimately the reason that Ukraine and Russia are, moving leaps and bounds ahead of most other countries is that this really matters and this has an impact. And I think she really nicely articulated that at the very beginning of the conversation, where she said, for every Ukrainian, this is an existential threat and this is a matter of survival. And if you are in the leadership of, the Kremlin and, part of Putin's close circle of influence, then it's also very important for you as well at that level. So there's very good reason why those two countries are moving ahead, and it's because it has, a real impact. It has an impact on the leadership of Russia, and it has an impact on every human in Ukraine. So in some senses, that's no surprise, and I'm sure if the UK, the US, and Europe were in a similar position where it felt a lot closer to home, I think we would really book our ideas up and we would start to pay a lot more attention to the adaptations that we need to make. I think the main message for me that came through in terms of what they do better is coordination and resourcing in a way that just allows them to get the best out of that civilian industry and that creativity.
Yeah, I mean, this whole ecosystem seems very kind of top-down designed in a way. It's not sort of necessarily waiting for the bottom-up innovation, but it's also a system they created where they can take advantage of all of the kind of pockets of bottom-up innovation within, say, the civilian technology space that can be brought into the military.
Yeah, and the usual, we hear this all the time about, China can make plans that are decades out. Russia is setting plans now where, kindergarten children will become part of the solution in however long that will take, more than a decade. And, this brings us back to this political cycle of just a few years, and how do we compete with that? And this is, an argument and a conversation that's been had over and over again. I'm sure there are political systems in place that would allow us to put strategies and resources that are locked in place that would survive a leadership change. But I just think we need to coordinate that better and deploy that sooner rather than later, because our democracy shouldn't hold us back from having long-term plans, and we constantly get reminded of reasons why we need to start thinking that way. We need to start thinking further out, more strategically, and not relying on somebody else to tell us what good looks like, but telling the industry, bring your creativity, but bring it in this particular space and to solve these particular problems. And when we give a problem to the broader society and say, we need this solving and we're willing to resource it, we get great success. So I think there's everything to play for. There's a lot of opportunity in this for us to be leaders. And I say us, could be anyone in the West. We just need to get coordinated.
I think we're in danger of making this final thought an episode in and of itself. But, this has been great. Chris, we've had a great conversation with Kate, and I'm looking forward to sort of hearing more about her research in the future. But yeah, thanks again for co-hosting this episode, and look forward to talking to you on the next one.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, me too. Thank you.
Sensing the Signal is brought to you by Iterate, the behavioural analytics company. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about what we do at iterate.io.